July 23, 1983. A Boeing 767 runs completely out of fuel at 41,000 feet. Both engines die. All electrical systems fail. The aircraft becomes a 132-ton glider with 69 people on board. The nearest airport is 120 kilometers away. Aviation experts say it's impossible to reach. But the captain is a former glider pilot, and he's about to attempt the most extraordinary dead-stick landing in aviation history. Everyone survives. Not a single person dies. This is the miracle of the Gimli Glider. Welcome to Black Box Secrets. I'm your host, and today we're investigating one of aviation's most incredible survival stories. This isn't a crash. This is a triumph. A testament to pilot skill, quick thinking, and the fact that sometimes the impossible is just difficult. What you're about to hear is how a series of mistakes created a catastrophe, and how extraordinary airmanship turned that catastrophe into a miracle. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications because we're uncovering aviation's most incredible true stories every single week. In 1983, Air Canada was transitioning from the imperial measurement system to the metric system. This was a complex change affecting everything from fuel calculations to maintenance procedures. The Boeing 767, Air Canada's newest aircraft, was designed with digital fuel gauges that displayed fuel quantity in kilograms, a departure from older aircraft that used pounds. But these fuel gauges had been malfunctioning, and the maintenance procedures to work around the problem were complicated and not well understood by all personnel. This would prove to be a fatal combination of factors. July 23, 1983. Air Canada Flight 143 was scheduled to fly from Montreal to Edmonton with a stop in Ottawa. The aircraft was a nearly new Boeing 767-200 registration CGUN, nicknamed Flying Banana by crews due to its bright livery. At the controls was Captain Robert Bob Pearson, 48, an experienced pilot with over 15,000 flight hours. First Officer Maurice Quintal, 36, sat beside him. Both were highly skilled professionals. In Montreal, before departure, there was confusion about the fuel load. The fuel quantity indication system wasn't working properly, so ground crew had to manually measure the fuel using a drip stick method and then calculate how much more fuel to add for the journey. Here's where the critical error occurred. The calculations were done using a conversion factor for pounds per liter instead of kilograms per liter. Canada had recently switched to metric, and confusion between units was common. The ground crew, the flight crew, and the fueling crew all made the same mistake. They calculated the fuel load incorrectly by a factor of nearly 2 to 1. The Boeing 767 departed Montreal with approximately 22,300 pounds of fuel when it needed 22,300 kilograms, less than half the required amount for the journey. Nobody realized the mistake. Flight 143 departed Montreal at 5:48 p.m., stopped briefly in Ottawa to pick up more passengers, then took off again at 6:48 p.m., heading for Edmonton. In total, there were 61 passengers and 8 crew members aboard, 69 people whose lives depended on fuel that wasn't there. At 8:20 p.m., as the Boeing 767 cruised at 41,000 feet over Red Lake, Ontario, warning lights began illuminating in the cockpit. First, a fuel pressure alarm. Captain Pearson and First Officer Quintal checked their instruments. The readings didn't make sense. Then more alarms. The fuel quantity indicators, already malfunctioning, showed confusing data. Within minutes, the situation became clear. They were running out of fuel. But how? The calculations before departure showed they had plenty. They had departed Montreal, stopped in Ottawa, taken on more fuel. How could they be empty? There was no time to understand why. They had to deal with what? At 8:21 p.m., the left engine flamed out. The sudden loss of thrust caused the aircraft to yaw. Captain Pearson immediately declared an emergency and requested vectors to the nearest airport. Air traffic control began coordinating, but they were over one of the most remote regions of Canada, hundreds of kilometers from major airports. Seconds later, at 8:22 p.m., the right engine quit. Both engines were dead. The Boeing 767, loaded with 69 people, became a glider. Without engines, modern aircraft lose more than just thrust. They lose electrical power. They lose hydraulic pressure. Flight controls become heavy or unresponsive. Navigation systems fail. Radio communication becomes difficult. The aircraft is designed to glide for a limited time, enough to restart engines or reach an airport nearby. But Flight 143 was 120 kilometers from Winnipeg, the nearest major airport. Captain Pearson did quick calculations. The Boeing 767's glide ratio was approximately 12-1, meaning for every 12 kilometers forward, it would lose 1 kilometer of altitude. They were at 41,000 feet, about 12.5 kilometers high. Theoretically, they could glide about 150 kilometers. Winnipeg was 120 kilometers away. It would be close, very close, but maybe possible. Then First Officer Quintal remembered something. He had been stationed at Royal Canadian Air Force Base years earlier. The base was called Gimli, and it was directly along their glide path, only about 65 kilometers away. "Gimli," he shouted. "There's an airport at Gimli." Captain Pearson made the decision instantly. They would aim for Gimli. It was their only chance. Gliding a Boeing 767 is nothing like flying one with engines. There's no thrust to correct for mistakes. If you come in too high, you can't go around for another approach. If you come in too low, you can't add power to stretch your glide. You get one chance, and it has to be perfect. Captain Pearson was a glider pilot in his spare time. He had thousands of hours flying sailplanes, understanding thermal currents, calculating glide ratios, executing precise dead-stick landings. Those skills, learned as a hobby, were now the only thing keeping 69 people alive. As Flight 143 descended in eerie silence toward Gimli, passengers knew something was wrong. The engines were off. They could hear the wind rushing past the fuselage. Flight attendants moved through the cabin, preparing for an emergency landing. Some passengers prayed. Others held hands. Parents held their children. Everyone understood that this landing would be extraordinary, one way or another. Captain Pearson lined up for runway 32L at Gimli. The aircraft was descending faster than normal because without engines they couldn't control their descent rate as precisely. They were too high, descending too fast. Pearson executed a maneuver called a forward slip, a technique used in gliding where you bank the aircraft and use the rudder to keep it straight, increasing drag and steepening the descent without increasing speed. The Boeing 767, banking sharply, slipped down through the sky toward the old runway. But as they got closer, Quintal saw something that made his blood run cold. There are people on the runway. What Captain Pearson and First Officer Quintal didn't know was that Gimli Air Force Base had been decommissioned years earlier and converted to a public motorsport facility. The runways were still there, but they were now used for drag racing and other events. On that Saturday evening, July 23rd, the Winnipeg Sports Car Club was holding a racing event on the runway. Families were having picnics. Kids were playing. Race cars were lined up. Hundreds of people were gathered on the exact runway where Flight 143 was about to make an emergency landing. As the massive Boeing 767 descended silently toward them, people on the ground looked up in confusion. Why was a commercial airliner landing here? Why were the engines off? Why was it coming in so steeply? Then they realized it was going to crash on top of them. Captain Pearson had no choice. He was committed to the approach. There was nowhere else to go, no power to go around, no options. He would land on that runway whether people were on it or not. He could only hope they would see the aircraft and run. People scattered. Parents grabbed children and ran toward the sides of the runway. Race cars reverted to their vehicles and drove off the runway. Spectators screamed and fled. The Boeing 767, silently gliding, grew larger and larger as it descended. At 8:38 p.m., 16 minutes after the engines died, Captain Pearson flared the Boeing 767 for landing. The main landing gear touched down first, hard but controlled. The nose gear descended. They were down. They had made it. Then disaster struck again. The nose gear, damaged or weakened by the stress of the glide, collapsed. The nose of the aircraft slammed onto the pavement, sending up a shower of sparks. The Boeing 767 slid down the runway, on its nose, main gear, and belly, grinding metal on asphalt at high speed. Spectators who had fled to the sides of the runway watched in horror as the massive aircraft slid past them, sparks flying, metal screaming. The friction generated so much heat that the nose tires, dragging on the pavement, caught fire. The aircraft finally came to a stop about halfway down the runway, nose down, tail up, surrounded by smoke and burning rubber. Emergency exits flew open. Evacuation slides deployed. Within 90 seconds, all 69 people were off the aircraft and standing safely on the grass beside the runway. Not a single person was seriously injured. Not one. A few minor scrapes and bruises from the evacuation. That was it. People who had been picnicking beside the runway stood in stunned silence, watching passengers slide down the evacuation chutes from an airliner that had just landed at a drag racing event. It was surreal, impossible, miraculous. The investigation into what became known as the Gimli Glider incident revealed a cascade of errors, none individually catastrophic, but together creating disaster. Metric conversion error. The fuel load calculation used the wrong conversion factor. Ground crew, flight crew, and fueling personnel all made the same mistake, calculating pounds instead of kilograms. Fuel gauge malfunction. The aircraft's fuel quantity indication system wasn't working properly, requiring manual calculations that were more prone to error. Inadequate training. Personnel weren't adequately trained on the new metric system and the proper procedures for manual fuel calculations. Maintenance procedure confusion. The complex procedures to work around the malfunctioning fuel gauges weren't well understood. Multiple opportunities missed. Multiple people checked the fuel calculations, but they all used the same incorrect conversion factor. No one caught the mistake. The report concluded that the accident was caused by a series of company and crew errors that individually were not catastrophic, but when combined, proved to be disastrous. But the report also praised Captain Pearson and First Officer Quintal for extraordinary airmanship. Their quick thinking, glider experience, and perfect execution of an impossible landing saved 69 lives. Captain Bob Pearson became a legend in aviation. He was awarded numerous honors for his skill and composure. But he remained humble, insisting that any competent pilot would have done the same. "We just flew the airplane," he said. "That's what pilots do." The aircraft itself, CGUN, was repaired and returned to service. It flew for Air Canada for another 25 years before being retired in 2008. Throughout its service life, it carried a nickname that never faded, the Gimli Glider. Air Canada implemented sweeping changes to fuel calculation procedures, metric conversion training, and maintenance protocols. The incident became a case study in how small errors can cascade into catastrophe and how proper training can prevent such cascades. The Gimli Glider incident is taught in every aviation school as an example of airmanship. Captain Pearson's glider skills, learned as a hobby, saved everyone on board. His ability to execute a forward slip in a Boeing 767 was extraordinary. Crew resource management. Pearson and Quintal worked perfectly together, making quick decisions based on incomplete information. The Swiss cheese model. Multiple failures aligned, like holes in slices of Swiss cheese, creating a path to disaster. If any one error had been caught, the incident wouldn't have happened. Always have a backup plan. First Officer Quintal's memory of Gimli Air Base saved the day. Know your options, even unconventional ones. The 69 people on Flight 143 all survived without serious injury, but the psychological impact lasted for years. Many passengers said they never feared flying because they had already experienced the worst possible scenario and lived. Others developed intense fear of flying and never boarded a plane again. Captain Pearson remained friends with many of the passengers. They would meet annually on July 23rd, commemorating what they called their second birthday, the day they should have died but didn't. Today, if you visit the Canada Aviation and Space Museum in Ottawa, you can see pieces of the Gimli Glider. The nose gear that collapsed during landing is on display, a reminder of the miracle that occurred on a summer evening in 1983. Gimli Airport still operates as a small municipal airport and motorsport facility. A plaque commemorates the emergency landing. Locals still talk about the day a Boeing 767 fell from the sky and landed at their drag race. The Gimli Glider incident asks us a beautiful question. What if your hobby could save everyone around you? Captain Pearson's glider experience, something he did for fun on weekends, became the difference between life and death for 69 people. His skills, practiced in small sailplanes over fields, translated perfectly to guiding a 132-ton airliner through an impossible descent. This is a story about mistakes and miracles. Mistakes in metric conversion, in fuel calculations, in procedures and training. But miracles in airmanship, in quick thinking, in glider skills applied to a Boeing 767. Every person on Flight 143 went home that night. They hugged their families, slept in their own beds, continued their lives. Because a pilot who flew gliders on weekends knew how to do the impossible when it mattered most. Could you have landed the Gimli Glider? What skills do you have that might save lives in an emergency? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more incredible survival stories from aviation's most impossible situations, subscribe to Black Box Secrets and hit that notification bell. We're revealing the truth behind aviation's greatest miracles every single week. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the impossible is just difficult.